Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Christina Stringer. I lead our wastewater and on-site programs division here at NUEPIC, which includes our tanks program that's spearheaded by Lillian, who I'm sure many of you already know. We're really excited to have you with us this afternoon. We have three great speakers lined up for you to share their technical knowledge, so you're likely to learn a lot over the next hour and a half. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about NUEPIC very briefly, because a lot of times we're focused on the Northeast, and I know a lot of you aren't from this part of the woods. So NUEPIC is a congressionally authorized interstate organization. We're one of 6 throughout the country, and we've been in existence since 1947. Our mission is to advance clean water in the Northeast through collaboration with and service to our member states. We have 7 member states, including 6 New England states plus New York. We perform a wide variety of activities in 5 key areas: connections, protection, education, engagement, and training, just like the webinar you're joining today. And while most of our work is focused in the Northeast, we do work at the national level in several important areas like non-point source pollution, state revolving fund. We have training workshops for both of those, and underground storage tanks. In fact, we have been supporting the EPA with the implementation of the National LUS program since 1983. And we're really proud to have been a part of the tanks community for that 40-year period, and are looking forward to another 40 years of working with you all. So to get started on our treatment trains webinar, we're going to start off today with Debra Thoma. Debra is a section manager at the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control in the UST Management Division. She's the Corrective Action and Quality Assurance Manager. And prior to this role, she worked as a project manager overseeing the assessment and remediation of releases from regulated and non-permitted petroleum releases. She's been involved with the development of the UST Programmatic Quality Assurance Plan, and was a member of the ITRC Petroleum Vapor Intrusion Team. Prior to her time with South Carolina DHEC, Debra worked for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service and has a Bachelor's of Science degree in Environmental Geology from the University of Wisconsin. So Debra, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you get started. Oh, I'm sorry, really quick before I do, I just want to say that we will have time between each speaker for questions. If you have a burning question while Debra or Tom or Ed are speaking, feel free to put it in the chat. Lillian will be monitoring that, and we'll key those up as soon as each speaker is done. All right, now I think I'm done, Debra. It's all you.
Okay, let me share my screen so everybody can see the presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. And hopefully that's working.
Looks good, Deb. Thank you.
Okay, so my presentation today is South Carolina's perspective of treatment trains for enhanced remediation effectiveness. And what I want to briefly do is, if I can find my mouse, it disappeared on me. Okay. Had this working before.
It's showing up on your screen, Debra, as a red pointer.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to my other. Let's see if I can just enter. Okay, now I'm having technical difficulties. Okay, follow my mouse. Yay. Okay. A little bit of background of South Carolina's underground storage tank program. We are a risk-based corrective action program, which means sites target levels are generated to be protective of identified current and future receptors such as surface water, features, utilities, water supply wells. Our closure requirements include that free-phase products be removed to less than 0.01 feet as measured in monitoring wells that are installed on the site. The program does not have any closure allowances for deed restrictions or restrictive covenants. We do have a conditional closure of releases under the conditions that the concentrations are below those established site-specific target levels, the plume is determined to be stable or decreasing, and future receptors will not be impacted in the future. A little bit of the history of our program and our remediation. We have been a pay-for-performance program. We began conducting various remedial efforts in the late 80s, early 90s. In those early days, we thought we understood what a completed assessment was. Typically, it was 20 or so shallow monitoring wells and maybe 2 deep wells. Our historical remedial efforts were usually one technology, such as air sparge, soil vapor extraction, or in situ bioremediation. Usually, in those rare instances where we had multiple technologies proposed, it was usually an afterthought and were only implemented when the main technology failed, and oftentimes costs were near exhausted. We now have a better understanding as we've gone through, 20, 30 years of what constitutes a complete assessment, and remedial efforts really need to change as site conditions change to effectively remediate sites. So we don't get stuck in that specific technology. And we're beginning to see that transition to more and more of a true treatment train approach, as with more defined transitions and concurrent technologies that target different zones within the plume. And hopefully as we start getting into these more, this presentation can be expanded to really highlight those even better. So some of our recent changes, recent within the last 10 years or so, we have implemented long duration aggressive fluid vapor recovery or multi media phase extraction. We typically historically only use short term, which were 8-hour vacuum events to address free phase products. We implemented these long duration, usually 24 to 96 hours, because we understood that those longer durations really dewatered and maximized the removal of the product. And they were proven to be much more effective. Now, within the past 5 years, we've begun a shift towards targeted remedial efforts. And this will likely evolve as we get more and more into more of a true treatment train approach for sites where different technologies can be deployed in different areas or in different phases to actually achieve the remedial goals. For us, it's really a paradigm shift for most to change the conceptual way that we think and approach remediation of petroleum at sites. Many want to stick with what they're familiar and comfortable with, regardless of whether it will be successful. They're hesitant to offer contingency plans in the event that the primary remedial method fails to achieve their remedial goals. So those are things we have to overcome. What I'm going to do is show you 4 sites, and those are the red dots highlighted here on the map, that ended up being a treatment train. They didn't start out that way, but that's how they kind of ended up. These sites were part of our state lead program, which for us, it means that the state took the lead on these to get these through the assessment and remedial aspect. These were sites where the OO was determined to either be unwilling or unable to perform the work. And we basically stepped in on their behalf and selected the contractor to get the work done. The first site is in Bamberg. And here's a Google Street View. It's basically an empty parking lot now. Here's the isopleth map showing the concentrations. This release was reported in 1993 4 tanks were removed at that time. It was reported as a pre-74 facility, which means the tanks were last used prior to 1974. Our investigative work was completed in 2006. The lithology is coastal plains, which was interbedded silt, sands, and clays. There is another release that was reported on this side of the block, which was the quick lube, but we determined that it was not an issue and it received a closure in 2008. Now, in the source of the plume, the total BTEX was about 145 parts per million. Free product was detected in this well right here at 0.9 feet. Depth to groundwater range between 4 and 14 feet. Now, between 2007 and 2014, we did 10 recovery events for 120 hours. We managed to remove 127 gallons of free product. At that time, the residual dissolved concentration ended up being 24.3 parts per million. Okay, so during the utility survey, what we did, we decided to do excavation to try to get this stuff out of the ground. So during the utility survey, they discovered 3 magnetic anomalies, which they suspected to be abandoned tanks. They ended up removing over 2,500 tons of soil, 276 gallons of water, excavated to a depth of 15 feet, and they did find 3 tanks, a 250, a 1,000, and a 3,000 gallon tank. They put in ORC advanced mixed with the backfill at intervals to ensure that if anything was left, it would be remediated through time. This is a couple pictures of the excavation. The south end, the north end. Here's one of the tanks that they found. Here's the 3,000 and the 1,000 gallon tank. Then pulling them out of the ground for transport. Then place the crushed stone in the excavated pit. Placement of the ORC and then mixing the stone with the ORC. Backfilling and compaction, leveling the surface before they did asphalt. Now at the end, once they asphalted everything, they put 4 wells back in. They did 3 confirmation groundwater sampling events. The final sampling showed a residual petroleum in the area of 5.6 parts per million total BTEX. It was below our closure requirements, our site-specific target levels, and we issued a conditional closure for this site in November of 2020. This is just an depiction of the cost. So our assessment cost about $70,000. Those AFER events and sampling about $79,000. Our excavation, monitoring, and closure was about $524,000. So our total cost for this site was about $674,000. Site 2, this is up in the upstate. Again, here's a Google Street View, the old store. You can see a monitor wall sitting here. This, again, isopleth concentration map. The release was reported in 91. 3 tanks were removed. All tanks were reported as gasoline. We completed our investigative work in 2001. This is up in our Piedmont, which is mainly red clay and sandy clay. The highest benzene, or the highest concentration of dissolved benzene was in, this is what this shows. The highest total BTEX was about 125 parts per million. It had a history of free product. So from 2002 to 2008, we did corrective action, which was a combination of AFER and chemical oxidation. They did put hydrogen peroxide and microbial solution was injected into temporary injection points. By January 2007, the free product was less than 0.01 feet, but the dissolved concentrations were still present, with a total BTEX about 83.7 parts per million. In 2008, the contractor that had been selected to do the work, we worked out a negotiated release of that contractor from the contract that we had entered into. Now, in 2013, free product showed back up at its greatest thickness of 3.34 feet. There were no tanks out here. We believe it was because the water table rose over 3 feet in that duration. Groundwater fluctuates greatly out here from 4 feet to 15 feet. So, you know, that 11-foot fluctuation basically flushed out a lot of stuff. 2013 to 2016, we conducted some of those long duration AFBR events, and we ended up getting 56 gallons of petroleum as a result of that. We still had a high dissolved concentration out there, and we decided, you know, this was another candidate for excavation. So this is the approximate area that they were going to excavate. They had to dig a trench and install sheet piling to take care of this. This shows, you know, them doing some of the excavation. It was down to 20 feet. They backfilled and put in some oxidizing compounds. The backfill and compaction. And again, once they were completed, they installed 3 wells. They did confirmation sampling in September of 2019, March of 2021, and October of 2021. The residual petroleum was down to 3.9 parts per million, and we issued the conditional closure in December of 2021. Again, just showing the cost for this, our total cost being just $468,000 to bring it to closure. This site is in Richland. This is about the middle of the state for us. Again, a Google Street View. This release was reported in 2002, so it was reported a little bit later than some of the other ones. The 4 tanks were removed in 1989. They were reported as gasoline. The investigative work was completed in 2004. Primarily silty clay and clay silt. The highest soil reading was about 10 parts per million. The highest dissolved BTEX was 31.4 parts per million. The depth to groundwater fluctuated between 4 and 17 feet. Remediation was conducted out here from 2005 to 2007. They injected about 2,300 gallons of hydrogen peroxide into 20 injection wells. This is one where the contractor was decertified under our program, and the contract was subsequently canceled. We did some subsequent sampling after that, and the residual BTEX remained elevated around 10 parts per million. So again, we decided, let's see if we can excavate this and see if we can bring this to closure. So this is a map showing their proposed excavation areas. They did this kind of in some phases because of just the area that was impacted. They did find, you know, those abandoned tanks. They had to remove them. They mixed the gravel with ORC and carbon this time. Site compaction. This is a completed site view once it was completed. They installed 3 monitoring wells afterwards, conducted post-sampling. Residual BTEX was 0.9 parts per million. A conditional closure for this was issued in September of 2022. Cost for this about $457,000. Now, this one was a interesting one. So, when you think that you can't implement a technology, sometimes you find an innovative way to make it happen. So this one is down in Charleston. This is a coastal county. This is a site layout of what the station looked like at one time. This is actually a picture of the station itself. This is what the site looks like today. The reported release happened in 1987. The tanks were removed in 88 and 2000. Investigative work was completed in 1997. It's coastal plain, so it's silty sand and sandy clay. This house was constructed in 2003. This house was not constructed without controversy. The service station was a fixture in the community since the 1930s. The initial request to demolish the building was denied by the Architectural Review Board in 1999. The Preservation Society felt the building had a distinct architectural character and played an important part in understanding the evolution of the community. However, by early 2000, the review board eventually granted approval, and this new 3.5-story residence was constructed. Now, looking at it today, you probably would think it would have been there for years, because it was built to match the architectural integrity of the area. Now, this shows what the site was before the house went in, and where the hotspot was, and where the house is today. So that hotspot's probably right about there. So 2003, monitoring wells had to be reinstalled after the construction was completed. We did some AFBR events in this area from 2004 to 2009 because it did have some products. All other wells that were installed out here were non-detect. Of 2014 to 2016, we did some passive free product removal. We did some more AFBR events in 2016 to 2019. In 2020, we did some soil investigation and collected soil samples from the crawl space under the house using a hand auger. The highest concentration was detected here with a benzene concentration of 613 parts per billion and total VOCs of 526 parts per million. So we just decided that we probably needed to look at trying to get some of that soil out. So the selected company worked with the property owner and the property owner's engineer to complete the excavation at this site. This was their proposed excavation. They removed 59 tons of soil. The excavation was to be about 8 feet where possible because it was coastal. Backfill was coarse gravel mixed with sodium persulfate. They had to do some anchors to support the residence foundation. This was the access point to the crawl space where they had to manually remove soil. This is the sodium persulfate mixed with the gravel. This is outside where basically in here where they backfilled, compacted. The old cinder blocks, patio support still visible. They did a temporary rain cover installed during reconstruction. This one, of course, because of the situation, costs a little bit more. Total cost is about $890,000. So over these 4 sites, the average time to closure was about 28.5 years. The average cost was about $621,000. again, the sites presented had multiple technologies deployed. We tried just about everything under the sun to get these sites to closure, and we decided that excavation was an effective source removal method and long-term treatment solution, and it was utilized when other remedial methods were no longer effective. And we brought some sites that were what we considered legacy releases to closure. And we're hoping that as we look forward to being able to implement targeted treatment technologies, both individually and concurrently, we can expedite site closures in the future. And it will allow for a more thought out and purposeful implementation of this concept with the remediation of petroleum releases in mind. So with that, if I can get my mouse to work, I am done.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. I appreciate it. Lillian, do we have any questions that have come through the chat for Deborah?
I don't see any. I think so far the chat has been pretty quiet.
Okay. Does anyone in the audience have any questions they'd like to ask Deborah?
I see applause though.
I know, very exciting. I like the use of the emojis or the reactions. I think that's what Zoom calls it.
I think so, yeah.
All right, lots of applause. Wonderful.
There is something that came up. Laura Jacobs asked, what is ORC? I think anyone, I mean, Ed maybe could take that on too, but I mean, yeah, anyways.
It's oxygen releasing compound. Sorry, I should have clarified that acronym.
Great.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
So Simona Platukite, I think is how you say that. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. She said she'd appreciate a little bit more discussion about the risk factors for receptors for some of the sites that drove remedial approaches, especially in cases where current site use is a parking lot. I think that's a bigger discussion, but if anyone, Deb, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, it would, without going into each individual site and being more familiar with the actual receptors for each site, like I said, most of our sites are, I mean, even though the site itself may be a parking lot, there may be a water supply well, on the next property, or there may be a stream or a surface water body, 2 properties over or something that's driving that need to remove the source. And I'm looking at some of the questions too.
Perfect.
So I don't know if you just want me to kind of keep going and
Absolutely, yeah. If you're seeing them, that'd be great.
Yeah. Yes, we still do use pay for performance as a corrective action for our contracts. We still do enter into that. In fact, all of our corrective action is based on a pay for performance platform. Even these excavations technically were paid for performance. They were paid for performing the actual excavation itself. None of it is done on a time and materials basis.
Yeah, but
no, we did not. I'm sorry.
I didn't mean to cut you off. I just don't want to run too far over. Are you okay typing the other answers in the chat?
Yeah, sure.
There's a type answer option.
Okay, sure, no problem.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
And we can always come back to these at the end if we have any other questions or if people have follow-up to Deb's typed answers.
Thank you, Deb. That was awesome.
All right. Well, let's roll right into our next presenter. Next up, we have Tom Fox. Tom is an environmental protection specialist in the Colorado Division of Oil and Public Safety. He serves as a technical lead, oversees remediation on petroleum release sites, and contributes to program efforts, including consultant registration, cost guidelines, report formats, staff training, and public outreach. That is a lot of hats, Tom. Tom has over 25 years of experience in consulting before he joined the Colorado Division of Oil and Public Safety. And he has also been active with the ITRC LNAPL team and the Advanced Site Characterization Tools team. So Tom, take it away.
All right, thank you, Christina. Let's see. We'll stop the video so I don't distract too many people. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to give you a quick overview of a buzz phrase that many of you have heard about treatment trains. And this phrase has really been in common use for only the past few years. It was probably initiated in a discussion that a group I had with ITRC back in the late 2010s. But basically, I'm here to talk about treatment trains and introduce a cousin, as I refer to it, called concurrent remedies. And I'll get into the difference between those two in a few minutes. But we're also here to talk about how these should all be planned in a project so you get the most benefit from this approach. Because we all can recognize that failing to plan is planning to waste a lot of, and you can all fill in the blank, but I like to use either time or money since everybody seems to be in short supply of those two things. Now, back in the old days, if I can use that phrase, by the old days, I'm talking about anything prior to maybe 2010, many states required that a cap to closure be submitted. Colorado was one of these sites. And we often ran into issues where, what does this really mean? And can you get to no further action or closure of a project in one try? Inevitably, we found that caps needed to be modified, often multiple times over sometimes several decades, as some of Deb's sites illustrated to you. So how are these modifications going to be made? How are cost changes and differences reconciled? And then ultimately, how do you judge remedial progress on the site? So ITRC tackled this a little bit in 2017 with a publication where they included this figure. And I wanted to point out the red arrow in the upper right corner that shows, is there some type of a contingency remedy specified? And this is probably about the first time that I've seen where it was officially recognized and then begun to brought into practice that contingencies need to be developed, that not everything will get you to the finish line in one go. So let's talk for a little bit about how to plan the life of your project instead of throwing things at it over time, which is typically an approach that a lot of people try to take. And it's frankly just very unprofessional in this day and age. So ITRC in 2018 issued the LNAPL site management document, and it included 21 technology tools. These are all useful in some fashion on a petroleum site. Deb has talked extensively about number one, which is excavation. It's very useful when it can be done. And we'll talk about how excavation, Deb talked a little bit about how excavation can be combined with other technologies like ISCO or even carbon addition, as Ed may talk about, to get you to closure. So I refer you to this document to look up some of these technology tools and when and how to use them in more detail. One thing that was not included in that document and was kind of frowned upon was for its inefficiency are these items: manual bailing, short-term vacuum truck events. And by short-term, I'm talking about a couple hours at a time in various wells, passive skimmers, and absorbent socks. And why weren't these covered is basically because the mass that's recovered of the LNAPL itself is really insignificant when compared to the entire mass that you're trying to address in your cleanup. In some states, however, these steps may be required. For example, maybe in South Carolina, where they have to remove free product down to 1/100th of a foot. So if you have a regulatory requirement, then you will still need to attempt to use some of these, but I encourage you to talk to your state agency about that. In the ITRC document, the technologies were broken into 3 general groups based upon what they do to the petroleum as the cleanup continues. The first one is called mass control, which is basically where you're creating a barrier or some type of a limitation on how far the LNAPL can move. Mass recovery tools basically look to remove the LNAPL or the LNAPL mass, dissolved or otherwise, in order to limit that migration. And phase change tools look to address generally adsorbed and dissolved contaminants that are within gasoline and abate those to acceptable levels within the state guidelines. So, for example, if LNAPL migration is a concern, a mass control technology would be your first group of technologies to look at. And if you had compositional effects, you'd look in the phase change. And there was a nice little ternary diagram that ITRC put out where each time a tool was talked about, it would put a dot in a corner. What was also recognized, however, is that some technologies will actually overlap. For example, you can institute a phase change technology along with a mass recovery technology, for example, dual phase extraction, and get kind of double the bang for your buck if that's something you want to do. Now, another way to look at this is to look at the processes that you're inducing at your site. And I've outlined the phase change versus mass control and recovery delineation at the top of the diagram. But basically, mass control and recovery refers to dominantly physical controls on LNAPL free product in and of itself. And then chemical and biological processes come into play to actually address changing the LNAPL as it is to dissolved or sorbed, purposely or otherwise, and then attacking the actual compounds, the BTEX compounds, pH compounds, for example, that are usually what is driven in the regulatory environment. What's interesting about this is generally physical controls are useful when concentrations of the contaminants are fairly high. And then as concentration drops, you're getting into more chemical and biological processes to address the lingering effects from the contamination. And again, on the left-hand side, just simply showing the efficiency of when you would use each of these processes. So now that we've kind of introduced these different processes in a different way to look at how these tools work, let's talk about how we can group the 21 tools that we had. So here is a kind of a bubble diagram that shows how I've broken out the 21 technologies that ITRC had outlined. And we can see we've got the physical, chemical, and biological processes. And again, you can see that there is often a bit of overlap between some of these tools as to how they work on your site. Physical generally refers to they're going to have some type of a site disruption, either excavation or a system installation or something like that. Chemical processes will refer to some physical phase or chemical change to a contaminant, and usually by your influence. And biological changes can be your influence or simply minor natural attenuation, where you enter into that type of remedial technology and encourage degradation in that effect. So in many cases, biological processes are a tool of last resort, unfortunately, and they're often relied upon where time is not critical or funds or access are very limited, but further cleanup still needs to be taken. So let's talk about some things like what will these tools do? What can they actually achieve for me? So every process has a limit to its effectiveness. For example, LNAPL recoverability. Everybody wants to get all the free product out of the well and out of the ground. Mainly it's to stop further migration and spread of contamination. There has been extensive documentation that a reasonable LNAPL transmissivity rate is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.8 square feet per day. If you are unfamiliar with LNAPL transmissivity, I can't get into it here, but I encourage you to look up the ASTM standard and also look on the American Petroleum Institute website for the worksheet where you can do the calculations to estimate LNAPL transmissivity, which is frankly a measure of its recoverability. Volatilization, typical site tools for this are air sparge and soil vapor extraction. You're going to look to see that the contaminant you're trying to remove is got a certain vapor pressure. In other words, it's volatile. And you may also want to look at, what your PID emissions rate would be. You're looking for some sort of a stable amount of whatever parts per million you might choose or your regulator decides to put on the site. Injections would include in situ chemical oxidation or ISCO and carbon injection also. Often soil textures or the geology that you're faced with can limit delivery of an oxidant or anything else you're trying to get into the ground. So you've got to be aware of that. And in the last case here, biodegradation, which might include bioventing and biosparging, or natural source zone depletion and monitored natural attenuation. It could be that the rate of degradation that these things are going to cause won't achieve your cleanup goal in a certain time frame. And this becomes really critical, for example, if you are trying to flip a property and have it redeveloped for another purpose. So can you close a site even if like biodegradation is not reaching your goals? Well, that depends on your state regulations. So I really encourage you to work with your state regulator and come to a common agreement and how you want to implement the cleanup. So let's talk a little bit about treatment trains. Treatment train is a consecutive remedy in one place. So these are technologies that are implemented in a sequence, as Deb has indicated. And these are based upon what your contaminant concerns and what your objectives are to get cleanup going. Often you're going to start with a primary technology, which might be excavation, as Deb had indicated. And again, that's tailored for the higher contaminant mass that you might find immediately after discovery of a release, for example, or very close to the release source. And then you would continue on with a second treatment technology, maybe ISCO, again, as Deb's has illustrated in her examples, and maybe even move on to a third polishing step, which would be carbon-based injections, or maybe enhanced biodegradation to address the contaminant mass. What's important and what I want to emphasize with you is to realize that your site, and again, it depends how contaminated it is and how extensive it is to start, but you may be able to clean it up with only one technology, but more often than not, you're going to have to plan what technologies am I going to use when the one I want to start with doesn't get me to closure. So treatment trains, as I've alluded to, very commonly, what is used at a site is unplanned. There's no objectives. There's no metrics for when you're going to move from one technology to another. There's no milestones and endpoints and so on that have been decided to switch from technologies. And this is pretty much illustrated when people are trying to throw more technologies at the problem. Unfortunately, I see this all too often. Now, what is good about treatment trains is when you plan them with smart objectives, and I'll get into some of this in a few minutes, how you decide when to transition by using metrics and what the milestones and endpoints are for the technology. So we're looking for an orderly implementation, if nothing else in the beginning, at least a conceptual layout of where you think you're going to be moving along this series of treatment technologies as you get the site ready for closure. So hopefully everyone gets the treatment trains concept. Now let's talk about the cousin that I've referred to, and I've termed concurrent remedies. So before, with treatment trains, we're talking about consecutive technologies where one is used one after the other. These are technologies that are used in different areas, perhaps even at the same time. So how do you plan to do this? Let's take an example here of a plume, a generic plume that I've drawn out. And the contours and different colors indicate a higher mass, pink being perhaps free product, and then lesser contaminations of, let's say, benzene further away from the source and indicating some sort of migration, perhaps toward a creek. For whatever reason, we have this odd little zone all off by itself, which is indicated by one well, which has some contamination in it. Why is really irrelevant at the moment. So how would we address a site like this when we find it? We've done obviously some site characterization to get to the point where we're ready to do something about it. What first we're going to probably look to try to remove the free product that we can. Again, this comes back to, can you do this? Is your LNAPL transitivity values with above the range where it's recoverable? Or do your regulatory agencies require you to go after it? So a technology you might use would be skimming, and there are several others you could do. I'm using this as an illustration only. The next thing you could look to do would be in the surrounding area where you don't have free product would be air sparging. So this is kind of a halo around the source area, for example. So let's move to yet another area of concern, and that would be the buildings themselves that are outlined. One to the left is the gas station building facility itself. The one on the right is an off-site property. I don't know what it is, and it frankly doesn't matter. But by the mere fact of air sparging and the high concentrations we have here, you're probably going to generate some vapor. And therefore, you need to mitigate that vapor and abate it by putting in an SVE system around the buildings to protect them so that you don't have vapor intrusion. Now, many people like to come out and they'll do air sparge and they'll design a complete coverage of SVE at the same time. Frankly, I find that a little wasteful of resources and very expensive. If the vapor is going to go into the soil and naturally biodegrade, as vapor intrusion, vapor often does, there's really no need to emit it directly into the atmosphere, create air pollution issues, odor issues, perhaps for neighbors, when you can allow it to naturally degrade in the soil. So we always try to get people to focus in on what are you trying to protect with your SVE system, rather than we have to gather up every single drop of vapor that we generate from our air sparge system. You'll find that this cuts the cost of your system and the installation and disruption to the site quite significantly. Finally, your final treatment train might be monitored natural attenuation. And that would address the small zone off by itself and also any lingering contaminants. And note that as I've gone through this, I've gone from greater severity in contamination concentrations to lesser severity. And this is a way you could do this. Now, what is really interesting about designing this out is that when you implement all these things together concurrently, you're kind of testing the different technologies that you're going to use as you clean up an area. For example, as the LNAPL is removed to a negligible thickness, perhaps, you could then begin and implement air sparging in that area to volatilize any residual LNAPL that's present. So you've already been running the air sparge system, you know how the site is behaving, and as part of your design, you'd probably want to put air sparge piping and everything within the LNAPL area, but simply not use it yet. The same with SVE. If you're looking then to move on beyond air sparging and work on SVE, you may only run that at certain times. And ultimately, the entire site is probably going to go to some type of monitored attenuation before closure. Now, one thing, I've shown you a map, and a lot of people forget the third dimension. And again, you can use, depending on your concentrations and extensiveness of your contamination, you can use different technologies in different ways. For example, you may be bioventing in the vadose zone, or SVE, as the case may be. You'll be skimming the LNAPL at the water table surface. And in certain areas, you may be sparging where the contamination is higher, or doing enhanced bio or even MNA in other areas where the contamination is less of a concern. So please keep in mind the depth of your target zones that you're also after with your technology too. A couple terms I threw out earlier, metrics, milestones, and endpoints. A lot of people get these all confused, and at this point they're like, what are you talking about? So let's give an illustration on this. So let's talk about my vacation, for example. So on your vacation, or my vacation, you can move to a different place by any of several different technologies. I've chosen automobile, airplane, or you can go by boat. So your technology is your means of movement. The end point, of course, is the end point of the technology. You can only drive or fly so far, and you have an endpoint. The technology won't get you any further. You have to switch to a different technology. For example, you may fly to some city, you have to rent a car to get the rest of the way, and you may end up walking to get to your final destination. So you can see right there, I've used 3 different technologies, each with their own endpoint to get me to my goal. Okay. Now, each of those may also have a milestone, and I'll use the last example of the ship, which is the ship may sail and it will stop in an intermediate port. And that is a milestone. That's a stopping point on the way to your final goal. What's interesting in this situation is what type of metrics would you use, to use the final term I've already implemented. So metrics would be typically in the situation would be time or distance. And that's how most people would measure how they're going from one place to another. Now, the metrics you'll use in your situation for petroleum cleanup are going to be quite a bit different, obviously. So let's talk about getting smart. And this is a term that's also brought up in the ITRC LNAPL document. And I'll go through each of them. This is just a quick mnemonic. So basically, specific means that you're targeting your treatment areas and you're defining your specific endpoints very clearly up front. You know when you're going to stop treating an area and you know what area to treat. You come up with measurable metrics, and these are going to be numbers that you will demonstrate progress toward an endpoint. This could be a certain concentration. It could be a rate of change. It could be several different things depending on your technology. So you need to be a little bit cognizant and also innovative in how you're going to measure progress. Agreed upon means that you have discussed this not only with the regulatory community, but also your client and even third parties, so that everybody understands what the concerns are and why the cleanup is going, what the goal of the cleanup is, your objectives, the treatment areas, and your metrics and endpoints, and maybe even milestones. So all these things need to be discussed and agreed upon so that there's no arguments later. The next to last thing is being realistic. We want to use a technology that has been demonstrated to achieve an objective in order to get you to a specific point in the cleanup train. And we also want to look for a schedule, or it's time-based. So you want to have a target date of when you think you'll meet your milestone or your endpoint goal. So keep the term SMART in mind. Again, this is all discussed in the ITRC document. So performance metrics are measurable characteristics. They are tuned to a selected technology. It will get you to a remedial objective. And the idea being to remove a concern that somebody has about the contamination being there. So this generally is going to apply when your state is implementing a risk-based cleanup process, and it's not strictly numerical or regulatory driven. But one of the things you want to think about as you're thinking about how am I going to measure my progress is ask yourself, what conditions do you expect to change as you're putting forces and influencing the site to get it cleaned up? And how quickly do you look at these things are going to be changing? So metrics, again, to emphasize, are technology specific. You track your progress toward an endpoint or maybe a milestone. You verify that the remedy is being implemented effectively. You allow for any mid-course corrections and optimization of the system operation or design. And it also gives you feedback as the system operates and things respond to the forces you're putting on the site to allow you to update and change your conceptual site model ideas. So you may find that some area of the site isn't cleaning up as fast as you thought it would. There's probably a geologic or some other reason as to why that isn't happening. And oddities like that are worth your time to investigate to find out why your conceptual site model is not what you thought it was. So here's some examples. So for air sparge SVE, we may look at concentrations in emission samples, your PID readings, benzene, and other things that you can monitor going up the stack or coming out of the ground. For in situ chemical oxidation, you may want to look at evaluating the distribution. Often you will see pH and oxidation reduction potential and dissolved oxygens, for example, to change as the ISCO application goes through its 45 to 90 days of life. Soil vapor extraction, you may want to get interim or even final soil conformation samples if your state requires that. And for M&A, you may want to monitor over time the organic and inorganic or even biological samples that you collect to document that natural attenuation and biodegradation are occurring, and perhaps at what rate. So these are the metrics. Let's talk a little bit about milestones. So these are interim objectives of places where you expect to be. You're kind of measuring your way along the path you've taken for yourself. So you inevitably have a schedule and some distance, if I can use that term, that you want to go. And so here's a little illustration, and often you'll find that your path may backtrack. You'll have a setback of some kind where you've got to circle back around and redesign your system, or put an extra air sparge point, or dig a little bit more. But at some point you have to stop using that technology because it's no longer useful. So here are some examples of remedial milestones. You may use, for example, a reduction in LNAPL. And these are just some examples. 10% of the volume that you've estimated to be present, you want to remove 10% per quarter or per month or some other time frame. Again, it's a number and a time so that you're getting a rate of removal. Emissions decreases, you may look for a 25% decrease in emissions every quarter, every month, every year, whatever the time frame is, it's agreeable for you. Dissolved phase concentrations, you may want to try to reach some type of an endpoint, or I should say a milestone actually, of how much contamination you're going to remediate. And one thing I do want everybody to understand is that often when you're looking at these declines in concentration, that these declines are often exponential. They're not going to be linear. At the beginning, you're going to think you're the greatest thing in the world because you're cleaning the site up so fast. And ultimately, you're going to find that things will turn asymptotic at some point because you've gotten most of the mass. There isn't much more to clean up. It's very dispersed and therefore difficult to collect. And this is where a problem with pay for performance programs come into view, when people think they can get something cleaned up in 2 years, for example, and at 2 years, they've only got to 90%, and getting their last 10% of the contamination to get their full payment is nearly impossible. So we've talked about our milestones. We've talked about the metrics of how we measure getting to our endpoints. And so these also are technology specific. They're going to be defined as a practicable limit of the technology that it can do for you, and or that your LNAPL concern has been addressed. And either of those situations are where your technology needs to be changed to something else, or perhaps you're looking at closure at that point. But the technology's endpoint often is not the goal of the site. In other words, to get it closed, your technology endpoint is merely a conveyance to get you partway to your site goal. And with that, I think that's the end.
Great. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, and I'll take any questions that we have time for.
Yeah, I think we have time for one or two.
Yeah, so the first one, there's one that says here, there's a general myth that an excavation is cheaper method. Is that true?
Oh, that's more of a question for Deb. Excavation can be very, very cost effective if things are suitable at your site. So let's talk about that for a minute. In several of Deb's examples, excavation was fairly shallow, not very extensive. The soils were amenable to removal. They weren't boulders, cobbles, or fractured bedrock, as we sometimes run into here in Colorado. And so, yes, excavation is certainly worthwhile. Excavation, not only to remove mass, is useful, but also to disturb the soil, for example, or to allow you to place back gravel or other materials that are coarser, for example, and would allow you to move to a different treatment technology, which is something that Deb brought up when they did the excavation, and then they would use ISCO or put back some other type of material as an amendment to the excavation. Here in Colorado, I like to advocate that people consider installing horizontal or vertical PVC pipe while the excavation is open, in the event that in the future they may want to add some type of amendment to the soil or move air, whether it's sparging or soil vent, to take care of any residual material that could not be removed by excavation. And inevitably, there will be some. So PVC is cheap. I encourage you to put it into the ground, stub it up somewhere and put a cap on it so you can find it later. But that's always a very easy way to make your excavation give you a little bit more benefit after you're done. To just follow up on that thought, obviously Deb had one example where excavation was extremely difficult when the site had been redeveloped and they were excavating in a basement essentially. So in that situation, you saw the price climb exponentially. And you know, that was what they decided to do there and what was feasible for their state.
Thank you. Christina, do you think we should go on to Ed?
Yeah, I want to make sure he has plenty of time. So
So if
thank you
there,
again, Tom. That was great.
yeah, and if there are other questions, you can put them in the chat in the Q&A box, and we can try to answer them over there.
Great. Well, rounding off our lineup today, we have Edward Winter. Edward is the Vice President of Remediation Products Incorporated, or RPI. He was the Assistant Director of Kentucky's Division of Waste Management until 2021. He started his employment with the Commonwealth in the Risk Assessment Branch in 2000 and held a variety of different positions. Prior to coming to state government, he was with the University of Louisville at Lion's Eye Research Center, where he had been a postdoctoral fellow. Edward has a BA from Tennessee Temple University and a BS and PhD from the University of Louisville. Ed, it's all yours now.
Ed, I think you might be muted. Oh, here, I'll ask you to unmute.
There you go. I'm unmuted.
Perfect.
Okay, we ready?
You're all set. Looks
Looks
good.
good.
Okay, so I want to talk about treatment trains versus just one thing after another. And I like to think about who my audience might be. So I'm going to make up a bit of an audience that may not include everyone who's listening, but that's all right, because then you'll be listening in on someone else's private conversation, which is far more interesting. So I'm going to assume that most of my listeners are regulators who work in a UST fund state and have to control those funds and produce a result with those funds. And as far as sites, I'll be thinking largely about gas stations and C-stores. So a treatment train is just an efficiency effort. There's no inherent value to employing multiple remedies. You just want to look at each technology and recognize that it has an application and a period of operation for which it is most efficient relative to the geological setting and the site goals. So what is efficiency? For you, efficiency is just the total petroleum hydrocarbons removed per your effort. And effort for the state is just time and money. So how do we attain efficiency? You start by knowing what it is you need to do. So do you need to remove one tanker or 100 tankers? In order to have a sense of what that is, you need to have sufficient site characterization. You need to locate the mass of contamination in its three-dimensional sense, both across the site and at depth. And you need to estimate that mass of contamination. That is your first job. It's this characterization which is key to an efficient treatment train. Without thorough characterization, any success you have is just an accident. Now, this is the most controversial statement I'll make, and people won't like it at all. But basically, if you cannot state a number for the mass of contamination, for example, 725 pounds of total petroleum hydrocarbon gasoline, with a sense of how wrong you can be, plus or minus 75 pounds, then you are in the still, I hope it works stage. And a series of presumptions and let's try this remedies is not a treatment train. Now, here's the common approach to characterization, and many of you have been in these UST programs for some years have seen this. There is a release. If somebody's reported a release or you find a release and you identify that as a problem, you'll come in and install some monitoring wells and soil bores, generally according to what the regulations you work under require. And you will come back with some above whatever your regulatory numbers are in those monitoring wells, et cetera. And that begins an iteration of more monitoring wells and more soil bores and more monitoring wells and more soil bores, generally sent out as directives to contractors. May not be called directives in every state, but this is the instructions you send out to the contractor and tell them, put in monitoring wells. In that time, you may excavate the UST lines in some other areas. You may do some sort of extraction, maybe it's pumping, maybe it's air sparging, whatever. You may put some oxygen in. These are what you'll see as typical efforts on these old sites that you look at that are now, many of them 30 years old plus. And at some point, you hit a point of frustration. You've got a development opportunity that the owner can't pursue, or the owner wants to retire, or whatever. You've heard all these stories. And you realize that you still don't know, after 20, 25, 30 years, the real location of the contaminant, of the contamination in this case, since it's petroleum, and its potential mass. In some cases, the contamination is not fully identified, usually is on petroleum sites. And the physical or geological parameters are still uncertain. So what do? Well, in the last 5 years or so, it's become popular to bring in the real-time field tools at this point, be it MIP, UVOST, HPT, resistivity, et cetera. There's a lot of them that have different purposes. But in general, let's just say you brought in MIP and UVOST, people look at the cloud diagrams of the contamination and they say to themselves, wow, now I know where it is. Now I'm ready to select my remedy. But you're still not ready because you still don't know the mass of the contamination. And in some sense, you're right back where you've been, only you've spent $40,000 to $60,000 on these tools. Now, in this particular case, when the site has already progressed through this history, you haven't done the wrong thing. This is fine. But let's talk about how the site ideally should have gone. So you should identify your initial problem. You install a limited number of monitoring wells and soil bores as per your regulations. And then instead of getting into an iteration of installing more and more and more, go ahead and bring in these tools early. And I don't have time to describe each of these in a treatment train presentation, but nevertheless, bring in MIP, figure out where your dissolved phase in, UVOS, figure out where you're bound to the soil mass. And at that point, you'll have a good idea where the contamination is on your site. The location of the contamination, the physical parameters, but you still need to collect soil samples for mass and speciation. A lot of times this is where people go wrong. They think, I just spent, $40,000 to $60,000 on these real-time field tools. Why do I now need to collect soil samples and for mass speciation? We'll get to that. Now, you can also use the same data to direct whatever additional monitoring wells you need, whatever additional soil samples you need. So that's why it's very valuable to do it early in design. Plenty of soil and aquifer sample material. Now, you have avoided that point of frustration, the loss of a development opportunity. And if you can turn the directives around fast enough, instead of taking years on a site, you're going to need to take months, because now you are ready for remedy. But let me emphasize the basics regarding field characterization tools. MIP and tools such as UVOST or OIP, etc., are intended to speed and optimize and reduce the number of soil samples and monitoring wells needed to achieve site characterization and ultimately help you meet your long-term objectives. But they are a little bit like the child's game, hot and cold, you know, where you hide an object, and as someone gets closer to it, you say, you're getting hotter, oh, you're colder, hot, oh, hot, warm, hot, cold, etc. Field tools can tell you whether you're hot or cold, and I'm generally speaking of UVOST, OIP, and MIP at this point. They cannot tell you how much, and they can't address bedrock, which is a question we won't be dealing with today. So you need more soil and aquifer material samples post the use of the field tools. Now, most regulatory agencies will require between 10 and 20% confirmatory samples. Now, I understand the controversy regarding the use of the word confirmatory, because you're not really confirming so much as you're just following through and making sure. But nevertheless, to calculate a mass and the variability, you need quantitative data. Without an understanding of variability from quantitative data, you can't make predictions, and your 3D representations are just cartoons. So Jim Deepa did these nice diagrams here on the right for us. And let me ask you, you've got a 2% LIF response and a 25% LIF response. In which are you going to use to employ, or where are you going to employ your remedies? To the real question. Are you going to employ it in the 2% or the 25% or perhaps the 10%? You don't know that without quantitative data. And I'll make this point one more time. Soil and aquifer samples, that material retains the majority of your mass. So if you look on the right, you'll see that in this particular case, 82% of the mass was retained on the soil and aquifer material. And this is not unusual. This is kind of a very typical number. Now, once you've thoroughly characterized the site, you know how much mass you have. 725 pounds, plus and minus 75 pounds. And I know pretty well where it is, better than roughly. Now you can select a remedy. Now, I can't go through all 21 remedies, and I won't even try to touch as many as Tom touched upon. But I like to think of them fairly simply. And that is, when do you dig? You can presumptively dig tanks and lines when the cost of the excavation is less than the cost of characterizing the area to determine if it should be excavated. Now, right now, anyone who's listening from California or New York is laughing. They're in the floor rolling around because that probably never exists for them. But in the South and throughout the Midwest, this can easily occur, where the cost of just running the lab samples is more than the cost of excavation. All other excavated areas should be thoroughly characterized. You don't want to dig up a bunch of soil, spend a lot of money, and find out you just missed the contamination. Thoroughly characterize, and consider segregating the soils to save disposition cost. Now, that'll be the last I talk about digging. The second way I like to think about technologies are active technologies. And I like to think of active technologies in my mind as those that remove free product. That's not fully true, but it's just the way I like to think about it. Because I like to get as much free product out of the way as inexpensively as I can. Now, the key example or a prime example of an active technology is some sort of mechanical extraction, such as pumping or dual phase extraction. And what you should keep in mind with these technologies is you need to stop as soon as you can no longer remove free product in a cost-effective manner. I will say, in my experience, I've seen more sites blow through their fund money doing active technologies than by any other means. Dual phase extraction. The rule of thumb is do a pilot study that demonstrates the effectiveness of that technology on your particular site and use that information to set your goals. The last technologies are passive technologies, and I like to think of these as technologies that require little to no maintenance. And when do you employ these technologies? When the plume is stable or the passive technology is expected to accomplish the same. When no risk pathway is completed or reasonably completed, or the passive technology is expected to accomplish the same, and when it's cost effective. Let's look at an active technology. Now, I'm picking on dual phase extraction today, I guess, but I want to show you a published study that asserts the dual phase system was successful and suggests that additional dual phase extraction be pursued on the very same site. Now, don't misunderstand. It's a very well-documented technology. There's no reason not to employ it when appropriate, but efficiency with active technologies is very difficult to sustain. Tom kind of hit upon this when he said, the first 90% is easy, the last 10% is hard. That's similar. So the general site characteristics, and I'm going to be very general with this. It's a Southern California gas station with hydrocarbon contamination within layers of permeable silty sand. These, the permeability is 10 to the -9 to 10 to the -6 centimeters squared a second. These levels are between silty sand to a medium, so should be good. It had been monitored over a decade, and groundwater fluctuations are between 1 and 2 feet, so they're fairly limited. The expectation is that this site is highly conducive to dual phase extraction. Now, prior to this effort, they had skimmed on the site. They skimmed for 55 months and removed 218 gallons of free product. This site also had significant oversight. There was university oversight. There was oversight from an oil company, from the contractor, and from the state. So a lot of people were looking at this saying, yep, this is what we should do. Now, this slide is really more of a prop than anything. And notice that it's at log base 10. So when you look at the trend lines, and you notice the trend lines on average kind of curved down, about the only thing you're going to draw from that is they looked at a bunch of monitoring wells, and it looks like after 384 days that they generally went down. Well, I'll sum this up in a manner that will be easier for you to understand, and that is after 384 days of operation, they extracted 81 gallons of total petroleum, hydrocarbons, gasoline. They disposed of 41,400 gallons of impacted water. Now, they didn't tell me exactly what the concentration in that impacted water was, but I kind of looked on the previous chart and said, let's say I make it about 1 milligram a liter and then make it all benzene, so it'll make the calculation easy. That's about 180 mils of benzene in that impacted water. 81 gallons and 180 mils. So was this efficient? Well, the stated goal in this particular project was to improve the quality of the groundwater underlying the site. So it was a vague enough goal. So, I mean, clearly you can meet that kind of goal. That kind of goes back to what Tom was mentioning, that you really need clearly stated goals. And they didn't state the mass. They didn't state the error on that mass prior to initiating work. So it'd be difficult to say what percentage of the mass they actually removed for their effort. The system itself also had a fixed operation. So they would move the extraction points quarterly. That was it. Every quarter they'd move them. They didn't look at the data to see if it needed to be moved earlier or later or anything like that. They just moved it quarterly. And the movement, as I just mentioned, didn't flex based on data. Now, I can't really say whether this is a success or not. Why? Well, I estimated the cost, and what I did is I used the guidance from Texas, looked at the guidance from Kentucky and guidance from California. And I did an estimate of the cost, which was not in the published paper. And I purposely estimated these costs on the low side. To give you an example, number one, personal mobilization cost is $840. This was the engineer getting in the car and riding out every quarter and standing around for an hour or two and coming back. So obviously that's a cheap cost. Operation and maintenance of the DPE system for Midwest cost is about $600,000. The reporting cost, and this would have been the initial design, the design implementation, the quarterly reports, and the final report, would be about $12,000. The water disposition itself is almost $27,000, and these are at Midwest cost. If this were California or East Coast cost, it would be significantly higher. So the total cost by Midwest cost, $668,130. California is approximately 1.3 times that, about $900,000. $900,000. That was 81 gallons of TPH, 180 mils of benzene, even though it wasn't really benzene, I just did the calculation that way, or 460 microliters per dollar per day at $1,740 a day. So what's the lesson? You need to find the point of efficiency for active systems. Set realistic goals for each technology. Keep mechanical systems of any kind. Dual phase is my example. I've just picked on that. It's a perfectly fine system. Moving between extraction points and operating at maximum efficiency. Make sure that you are not primarily removing impacted water. The dissolve phase does not sustain a risk to a site. It may act as the conduit for risk, but it doesn't sustain it. Remember, the mass bound to the soil and aquifer material is what sustains a risk. In the case of dual phase extraction, very popular, and that's why I'm picking on that technology, properly applied vacuum and tip position are imperative. Some people call that tip position the position of the stinger. Both these elements, the proper vacuum and tip position, require eyes on the system. If someone's installing a system and walking away from it and coming back later, they are certainly not getting maximum efficiency out of that system. As mentioned earlier, do a pilot study to demonstrate the effectiveness and set goals, not just for dual phase extraction, but for any active system, because active systems are expensive and their efficiency can drop significantly and quickly. Finally, don't break the bank if you're not in any real danger of completing a risk pathway. See, a treatment train is just efficiency, and you need to balance the treatment train effort to goals. So efficiency is what? The total petroleum hydrocarbon removes divided by effort. And what is your effort? Your effort is time and money. Now, some properties have redevelopment pressure. Other properties are isolated. Some have completed risk pathways. Others are insignificant as far as risk are concerned. And you need to trade time versus money or vice versa according to each site's needs. So you don't apply the same technology to each site. You don't look at each site as having the same risk, and you don't expect each site to close at the same time because you are balancing. And you need to consider that balance before you select your treatments, not after you've exhausted the money. Effort, time, and money. Now, this is hard for people in a regulatory position to think about unless you've maybe worked in Superfund. But your action should be selected against a no action alternative. A no action alternative itself is only reasonable when you can cite the mass of contamination and an estimate error on that mass. This assumes you understand the geology well enough to evaluate the potential for completing a risk pathway. If you have the data to know that you don't need to act, keep in mind you also don't need to spend your money on continuous sampling. Now, I'm not really suggesting that you not take an action. But if you think about any sound scientific experiment, you have to have controls, right? Examining what will happen if you do nothing is your control. If you've worked in a Superfund program, you'll know when you get to the RIFS stage, which is Remedial Investigation and Facility Study, and you pick a remedy, one of the possible remedies is no action. It at least, if nothing else, acts as your control. Now, it's not surprising that this is not an all or nothing proposition. For example, on one site, you could not do anything in one area and bioremediate in another and do some sort of active remedy on another, as discussed by Tom. But nevertheless, you should have in your mind, what happens if I do nothing? And when you take an action, that action which you take should be relative to the scale of the problem. So plumes are limited in length, and natural attenuation really does occur. Now, whether you call it monitored natural attenuation or natural source zone depletion, there's some difference between those two ideas, but in the end, it's nature's taking care of it is the idea. So knowing the mass of contamination helps you set the parameters for action needed to protect human health and the environment. And if you know that, then you have a sense of what no action means on a particular site. Now, plumes are rarely out of control. So here are two results I'd like to point out to you from a paper that was published in 2015. It's pretty well known. But if you look at the median plume length for benzene out of 165 sites, it was 180 feet, which is typically the frontage on a small gas station or C-store. The 90th percentile on your benzene plume out of 165 sites was 425 feet, which means that most of you in your career might see one or two plumes that are that long. Newer sites rarely get this long. These are based on older sites for the most part.
Ed, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to let you know we only have a minute or two left.
Well, I'm sorry. I didn't know I went so long. Okay.
You
Well,
just have too much good information.
okay. Well, I'm going to close this up. Look at your no action. Look at the half-life in groundwater in years. The half-life is about 3 to 4 years. If you take an action, like I see here on the left, that's the post-BOSS 200 injection soil half-life. You'll see that it was significantly improved. Most passive remedies are bioremediation to increase your biodegradation. So this is the third point. You should buffer the total petroleum hydrocarbon concentrations. In other words, remove them if you can. You need to disrupt the soil and aquifer structure holding the TPH mass. You need to provide electron acceptors, either oxygens or sulfates and nitrate. You need to deliver nutrients such as vitamins and amino acids, and you need to balance the nitrogen to carbon ratio. Each remedy may not do all these things, but this is what you would do ideally. Summary. Excavate presumptively when the cost of characterization of the area is greater than the excavation cost otherwise characterized prior to excavation. Extensive characterizations such that you can estimate the mass and error of the mass, Active remediation efforts must be carefully planned and have specific goals, eyes-on oversight, and predetermined cost ceilings. And passive remedies need little to no maintenance, save money, and should be pursued as early as appropriate to achieve site goals. There's no inherent value in altering between remedies. You are simply trying to achieve efficiency by balancing time and money to attain site-appropriate goals. Postscript, always consider the people you work with, because not every project manager has the same skills. What one project manager can pull off at another site, another one may not be able to. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ed. We appreciate it. Ed, I'm wondering, since we are at a little over time, would you be okay if people reach out to you via email if they have questions?
That will be fine, thank you.
Okay. Lillian is going to send the presentations, I believe, right, Lillian?
Yes, I'm going to try. We will definitely be sharing the recording on YouTube, but I'll also try to email out the slides. And there's also a post recording survey that will be sent out once this meeting ends.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Lillian, and thank you, Debra, Tom, and Ed. We really appreciate you being here today. And thank you all for attending. We hope to see you again at our next webinar. I hope everyone enjoys their afternoon.